Right, I'm going to start very quickly, trying to, in the 20-25 minutes, to give an overview. It's the fourth year of my PhD practice. It's the final year in which I'm finally kind of finishing the writing of my thesis, which will be submitted in August 2011, so in a few months' time. I have decided in this paper to make a parallel reading, and that is because it's part of the way I have written the thesis. The parallel reading would be, on the one hand, I'm going to talk about a brief description of some examples of my work, and on the other hand, I'm going to give a reflexive and a retrospective analysis of my work, which allows me to bring some key points and issues of theoretical and historical investigation that I'm doing in the research. So, there are three projects in which I've produced during the first 3 years of my PhD. Each project consists of a stage in the research during which I explored methods of entering, documenting, and investigating a territory, physically and visually. Through my experimentation in the three projects, a method of filming and narrating was developed in my practice between an objective map and a subjective experience of motion and site-specific documentation. The three projects is 2755 miles, taxing in the city and under the city. They are all diverse, and especially in the final result and the way displayed in an exhibition. However, they all relate to notions of traveling and documentary practice in one way or another. So I will only have time to concentrate on the first one, which I think is the most vital, as it was the most spontaneous one, but actually links to the research I did after. So 2755 miles, and you will see an example at the end of the presentation, a 5-minute one, is a 70-minute video that engages with issues of migration and displacement by concentrating on the cultural and communal worlds of semi-legal Pakistani refugee workers living on the outskirts of Athens. Each title corresponds to the geographic distance between Pakistan and Greece, the two locations that constitute the start and end point, even if temporal, of the networks that smuggle economic migrants from the subcontinent into Europe. The narrative is located within a horse riding club, where the men live and work. Within this area, they also find concealment, because most of them, they do not have a permit or an asylum protection as yet. Also, another thing that I try to emphasize in the way the video was produced, or the scenery in the video, is that the fact that they're all male-dominated communities, male migrants mainly, or all. So retrospectively, I want to concentrate on the history and geography of the location where the projects were produced, because that kind of revealed an understanding of the practice, of the way I practice in this landscape. You can see on the left corner, for me, the Athens International Airport, and then the big highway that crosses the land and divides all these rural land and fields. It's a private highway because you have to pay tolls to enter. Also, there is an indication there, the horse riding club, where the filming was produced, and all the red line around it is the film journeys during documentation, during filming. So the city of Athens, as one of the many examples in Europe that could be linked to the notion of the postmodern urban milieu, is a city that gradually experiences changes on its terrain. This urban reformation is a product of national economic, socio-political factors that has as a result the emergence of new social relations and cultural formations in particular areas. As the city expanded to its outer margins with the beginning of the new millennium, it was subject to the construction of the private highway, the international airport, the transportation methods, metro, trains, buses, taxis, which had as an effect a major transformation of the area and its visible and invisible population. This resulted in a clear segmentation of the urban and rural landscape and the production of in-between spaces and gap zones that were due to be acknowledged as the sites for migratory life in the 21st century. This transformation at the margins, the terrain vegs, became even more explicit as new waves of illegal migrants began to reach the country the last decade. I'm not going to explain this, a little bit is explained in the text. It's just an example of such a gap zone. This is imagery from the film, and I have used it as a juxtaposition in the landscape. Just some examples of the stills. These places and non-places of peripheral life are in actuality central to the refugees' presence and subjectivity. Hence, we are concerned with the emergence of new geographies due to the transformation of the city's infrastructure. But also these new geographies could be termed as physical geographies, as social spaces, spaces produced by social and cultural activities, that they are invisible and unregistered on the known map of a city. The air flights, highway routes, metro, taxi, and bus services all consist of visible journeys traversing this area that is directly connected to travel. In juxtaposition to the evident manifestation of mobility, another invisible system of travels coexist on the margins, on the urbanized landscape, what I call sub-narratives of mobility within the city. Such a sub-narrative, which is of semi-legal mobility in the city in one way, is the opening and closing scene of the video, which you can see up in the slide. Unlike the rest of the narrative, these two scenes take place inside a car and document the journey that some of the migrants and I made to the center of Athens to covertly receive a newly arrived Pakistani family member of theirs, who reached the country through smuggling networks after a month in transit. The camera, positioned on the dashboard of the car, facing in, it captures the event in an observational manner within the confined space of the vehicle. This event, just to clarify, was not something that it was pre-planned for the making of the film. It was just something that it happened for me to coincide, to be there with these people while they were going to collect their friend. A different sense of motion and documentation altogether is exposed when the camera carried on horseback in parts of the narrative. It is used as a handheld device. In this case, the horse, like a camera dolly, allows filming to stay in motion, producing in effect a kind of tracking shot. Horse and car appear to be used in the project as tropes for transportations, as research methods, and as camera positions where the video can capture a more direct and intimate aspect of my experiences. I want to go back now, jump out of the project, and remember that this is a retrospective understanding of what the project have done. At the time of making it, it wasn't a conscious decision of using specific ways of practicing in space or filming. So now I want to very quickly go cover the urban theory and architectural practices of the 60s and 70s and make a reference in which traveling in situ and walking was a way of reclaiming space. Drawn from the activist practices of the situationists in the late 50s, the derive, meaning drift or drifting, presented a method of passing through and behaving in space, which opposes to the classical notion of journey or stroll. The means to travel, as an attempt to register and diagonally cross a terrain, were considered at the time as physical experiments and as a ways of encountering what one finds there. This in situ exploration of the terrain through practices of specialization produces and simultaneously documents what Hubbard terms physical geographies, geographies of intimate or undocumented spaces in which the material landscape is not just a backdrop of a plot, as it appears on a satellite image, but a product of social relations and cultural formations. These images are documentations of a long trip, walking trips that the Italian collective Stalker took during the 90s, and that the previous one and these are just examples of their practicing in situ. And in a way, their actions describe methods of geographical mapping, physical tracing, and traveling in site-specific research, which attempts to forge a different kind of geographical discourse. And this particular image, when I came across through their travel diaries and documentation, I found it interesting because the walking bodies in the field, they could be related to the researcher's body, the walking body of the researcher, but also it could be related to the migratory experience that was yet to be acknowledged from the 50s onwards. So the present era could be understood in terms of a dichotomy between pan-European transnationalism in reference to this kind of neoliberal vision of a borderless space of Europe. For travelers and tourists, on the one hand, and obsessive migration control and strict border policies that started to be introduced since the 70s on the other. Due to this continually growing phenomenon of migration and mobile subjectivities, it becomes apparent the urgency to rethink and redefine notions as that of geography, cartography, and human mobility in order to take into account the transformation of space occurring in local and global scale. The specificity and immediacy of field work, as in ethnography, documentary, video essays, journalism, activism, and the role of digital technologies propose new modes of vision and knowledge adapted by contemporary art practices. And I have some examples that maybe some you're familiar, some of them were mentioned as well. By multiplicity, the different case studies they do, and this is an example of forming a map, a new cartography of space and an understanding of space. And this image kind of presents the Mediterranean Sea as a cut-out solid continent, crisscrossed in different vectors by tourists and smuggling networks and refugees holding a different status. Then you have another example, again by multiplicity, the roadmap, which is, documents the two different travels that an Israeli and a Palestinian traveler made from starting from the same latitude and ending at the same one. And it actually documents the difference in the transportation methods used, in the time that each of them took them to go from one place to another. But most interestingly was the visual results of these travels, which in the one you have a road trip, on the other one you have a more kind of tiring way of changing through different transportation methods on walking and crossing checkpoints. And then it's the video essay, which was very nicely kind of linked today with the first presentation by